So in Warhammer 40k 10th edition, it seems that points are in and power level is dead. Let's talk about army balancing mechanics and whether or not the power level system will be missed. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about another mechanic that Games Workshop has removed from the game. As with a fair few things in Warhammer 10th edition, it seems that Games Workshop is going for simplicity, and it looks like two methods of army construction are more or less becoming one. In one of their recent army construction posts, they mentioned that power level was basically going away entirely, something that fit in quite well with the datasheets that we'd seen. It seems that, like it or not, points are going to be the main system to balance 40k at any sort of big level games, and power level is basically just not going to be a thing. In 40k, power level was basically a system that Games Workshop invented at the start of 8th edition. They decided that there were going to be two different ways to balance an army. Previously it had always been points, but now they'd also have the option of a sort of easy build power level for people who didn't want to faff around adding up too many points costs. Therefore, on each datasheet they had a power level number on the top left hand corner of it. Power level seems to equate to roughly 20 points, give or take a bit, and if you built out the squads to bigger sizes or made a couple of other choices, it might cost you a little bit more power. In general though, it didn't really go into the fine details. Say for example, it didn't really matter what war gear you took on the unit, it just basically cost the power level that it did, so there was no incentive not to take maximal gear on squads that had lots of options. I think the idea was generally that this was just supposed to give you a very rough forces that should be kind of equal against each other, while not quite expecting the same sort of balance that points would bring, which even on the finer scale could be a little bit questionable in terms of game balance throughout much of 40k's history. I think there was perhaps more need for power level at the start of 8th edition maybe. For those who've played 8th and 9th, points changed really quite a lot in 9th edition. In 8th you had a table for the points cost of each unit, and then you had to go hunting through big tables of war gear to see if they had any choices that cost points. It could often mean that you'd have to add up 3 or 4 different numbers in completely different sections of the army roster, as opposed to the much more simple way that we have with 9th edition, when only a few things cost points and they're listed literally under the unit. In any case, Games Workshop seems to think that power level has had its time. It's going to be gone from 10th edition, it's not on the datasheet, and it seems that it's just points from here on out. Seeing as removing the way that a lot of players balance their games is quite a big deal, I thought I'd ask a poll as to which of you guys use points or power, which system you prefers to make use of for making your armies. To be honest, I would have guessed that points would have been in the majority, but I perhaps wasn't sure if they'd be quite as preferred as this. It seems that out of 32,000 votes from you guys, it looks like 91% of you prefer points, about 6% of you are either ambivalent or regularly use both, and only 3% tend to use power level. It's possible that the numbers might be a little bit skewed here. I suspect that people who use power level might tend to be a bit newer to the game and maybe might not engage quite as much with loads of 40k content online. So I'd guess that it might be a tiny bit underrepresented by this, but I honestly don't think that would really skew the data all that much. It does seem to be pretty decisive that the vast majority of people out there use points over power level. I guess given that, it's maybe not too surprising that Games Workshop think that it might be worth removing for simplicity's sake and try and unite everyone together under one system. In 8th edition, Games Workshop started power level either as a slightly more casual balance system or the main way that you balance things in Crusade, though it has got a few other uses in 9th edition now. Its primary purpose is just simplicity for balancing Warhammer. There's really quite a lot going on when you're jumping into the hobby. Certainly in 8th and 9th there's been a very steep learning curve that people have to get over. 10th edition looks like it's trying to reduce that as much as possible, but I've heard a fair few people say that power level's a pretty nice stepping stone into regular 40k. This system is a quick and easy way to balance some armies without having to go too far into the nitty gritty, so you can focus on learning stuff before you find out how points work. It is also, of course, the primary balance system for the Crusade mode, the narrative play that Games Workshop has offered. In terms of comments on that poll on things, the majority of people who said that they like power level generally said that they tend to use it with Crusade. That one's definitely a fairly big push towards people actually using it. Crusade's got a whole bunch of fun narrative rules within Warhammer. It's a fairly popular game mode that quite a lot of people play, and the rules are entirely written with power level in mind. There's no indication that you could swap out for points, though to be honest I think that Crusade mode did work absolutely fine if you use points instead of power. Just use 1 power as 20 points. And again, anecdotally, I have heard that that's a fairly common variant in play. I've seen a number of people saying that they use Crusade but with points down in the comments over the years. It's not exactly a massively obvious way that you can vary play though, so I'm not surprised that the majority of people who play Crusade use power. Otherwise, it's kind of interesting that power level sort of bleeds over into a bunch of other rules within mainstream 40k, even if you're entirely using points to balance games. For one notable example, in a recent codex, the Demon's Army has a bit of a weird restriction, saying that even if you're using points to balance your game, if you want to run an allied demon force without ruining detachment special rules, you can only take 25% of the power level of your army as demons, even if you're not using power level for the main balance. That was a bit of a weird system, I must admit. Not sure why they chose to do that. It's just a bit awkward for army construction, meaning that you both need to try and fill points and power level to get a certain amount of demons in your force. They don't perfectly line up, so it's a little bit tricky if you want to max out that allowance. Otherwise, it tends to creep in a bit with a few stratagems as well. Some stratagems base themselves off unit power level, basically being a way to say this costs more command points for a really big unit than a really small one. And if they're not targeting model numbers or given unit keywords, power level maybe isn't the worst idea for that. Again, I suppose that will be common to both systems no matter what you're playing. One example will be the Adeptus Mechanicus Wrath of Mars stratagem. Normally that's a stratagem for some extra mortal wounds that normally costs 1 CP. It costs 2 CP though above 10 power level. Those ones are kind of few and far between though. I feel like most codexes stratagems tend to balance it around model numbers or battlefield roll and things, as opposed to using power for that. Finally, perhaps another one of the most prominent uses will be things like strategic reserves. They're all completely command point free in Arcs of Omen, of course, but if you're not playing that game mode, then it costs command points to put units off the board. Again, that's an increasing system where it costs more if you're adding more power level off the board, and again, that doesn't use points. Generally in current 40k, perhaps the biggest uses are easier army construction. It's baked into Crusade mode, and then there's a few other niche use cases. I'd say that out of any of these though, perhaps only the army construction is the real unique selling point. I feel like literally all the rest you could just implement with points if you wanted to, and I don't think you'd really lose anything. In general, I think you could make quite a few criticisms of the whole power level system. I feel like it did have a fair few fundamental issues as soon as they implemented it, to be honest. A few of these I've seen mentioned over the years, a bunch by people under that poll. Going through a few of the major criticisms quickly, I feel like first off, having a system that splits the player base is maybe not the best idea. It does seem that at least now the vast majority of people seem to use points if you were just going for a random pickup game of Warhammer 40k. Though if you're just completely used to using power level and you rarely use points, it's maybe just another thing that you need to ask and clarify before you have a game. You might have just entirely built your army and designed it around one system and it doesn't work too well in the other. It might change your choices and what sort of things you might want to run. Obviously, with a bit less granularity, power level is going to be less precise than points. It's just a very blunt instrument for making a balanced game. There's no way it really has to distinguish between anything that's greater than 20 points worth of granularity. It just doesn't allow you enough to reflect small changes between war gear, or say two different squads in your army, one of which might be around about 5 points more valuable than the other. But in power level they might well come out the same. One of the biggest criticisms of power level is that it can make war gear choices very skewed, particularly for units that have a massive difference between a fully loaded squad and a bare bones one. Perhaps Space Marine veterans are some of the best examples. The Death Watch can have everything from basic bolters all the way up to all manner of power weapons, frag cannons and heavy thunderhammers. Vanguard veterans could just be walking and have chainswords, or every man taking a thunderhammer and storm shield, which is really quite a lot more threat. It kind of also feels like you're penalised if you're not taking the biggest, nastiest bit of war gear around. You've kind of played the power level for it, so why not bring it along? It does seem, though, that in the second half of 9th edition, Games Workshop have been giving more and more squads just complete free war gear. Things like Space Marine tactical squads being basically able to take whatever they like, or Guard Sentinels having no points difference between the different weapons they can choose. If 10th edition doubles down on that, and I feel like there's at least a reasonable chance that it might, I guess that would remove one big advantage that points had over power level if everyone's going to be getting free war gear in their squads, so again it just makes sense to take the nastiest stuff. Finally, perhaps another weakness of power level in terms of granularity is that it doesn't really reflect mid-sized squads. Say you happen to own 7 Space Marine Terminators in your collection, if you happen to field any more than 5 of them, you'd basically be paying double the cost in power level for the unit, even if you hadn't been able to field it all the way up to 10. Again, feels like a very all or nothing thing, perhaps similar to the war gear. Due to this, I feel like perhaps even more than points, power level kind of needed to be used with the right mindset. 40k in general with points has enough balance issues all of its own, and generally you might need to have a bit of a conversation with the other player as to what sort of game you're looking for. But power level perhaps just adds one extra system that could be gamed or skewed to one player's advantage over another. Say for example, if one player doesn't try to maximise things like free war gear, and the other person does. I feel like even at casual level we often get people who just want to try and design the best army that they can. In general, if you're trying to do clever things with list building, I feel like the point system is just going to be a bit better for that, as power level just means a lot of units are super weak or super strong, depending on what side of the free war gear and exactly which power level the small points cost differences map to, as to whether or not a unit is vastly weaker or stronger than it perhaps should be in points. Another thing that I thought was maybe a bit of a strange move was when Games Workshop updated all the power level in tables. I guess with all the points changes throughout 8th and 9th, points had got rather divorced from the power level on the top left bracket of the unit, and they decided to try and rejig everything to make the power level game system a bit more balanced. I certainly can see why they did, but the way that they did so was maybe a bit on the painful side. Unless you were using the Warhammer 40K app or Warpedia, the way that you'd find them is from some enormous massive tables that they had as a PDF download document. And well, I'm sure it helped curb some of the worst excesses of the highs and lows of power level. It also kind of runs that cross-purpose to what it wanted to achieve in the first place, as now that simple number on the top left of your datasheets might well be out of date in your codex. If you want an ease of access way to play, then having to pour through online documents or go to a third-party or Games Workshop's app just perhaps doesn't really help with that. In terms of its core use though, I feel like a fair few people might argue that it's not really that much easier to build a list with power level than points. It definitely has a few less numbers to add up, but it didn't really seem to be a system that anyone particularly needed to get into Warhammer prior to 8th edition. Before that, there was always points and they kind of worked fine. Even if you're building a very basic army list, you could just keep on adding on your numbers to your phone calculator until you hit your points value and go with that. And otherwise, with tools like Battlescribe out and about, list building just isn't really quite as hard as it perhaps used to be in the past. Either one of those works fine. Certainly if you're familiar with Battlescribe, list building can be fairly quick. Finally, and perhaps not the core target of power level army building, but quite a few people really quite enjoy the list building process as part of the 40k hobby experience in general. Looking at each unit and deciding whether or not to equip each model with a gun that costs a certain amount of points is interesting and kind of allows you to tailor it to the way that you might play. I'm sure there's probably a fair few people watching who have about 1 million Battlescribe lists saved on their phone. You certainly can tinker with things with a power rating, though maybe it just undermines this little bit of the hobby and how interesting it is, though obviously more for some than others. In any case, in 10th edition, power level does seem to be dead now. As per the poll, it looks like not that many of you are really going to be missing it too much. Less than 10% of 32,000 people used it regularly. I must admit, based on the above criticisms, I'd argue it didn't do its job enormously well. I feel like that might be the reason that not that many people tended to use it, perhaps only helpful to a small chunk of the hobby, and people who might have been railroaded into it a little bit by it being the only normal option to play Crusade with. I feel like it perhaps needed to be a reasonable blend of someone who didn't really like adding up the points, plus having the self-awareness not to try and game the system too heavily, and also have a fair few like-minded people around you who are all happy to play power level as opposed to using points. I would say that it has probably become a bit more redundant over the course of 8th and 9th rollout, just with points list building being a lot easier with the new system compared with that particularly painful old one adding up the tables. For 10th edition, we still don't have an enormous amount of how much points are going to be costing. At time of recording, we haven't seen any points costs for things like the Termagants or the Terminators. It looks like points costs are going to be on an army construction page with a few other details as to how many units you can take in the squad, what war gear they can use, and whether or not they're battle line. My guess would be there's probably going to be a whole bunch of free war gear in 10th edition, perhaps more so than in 9th. I strongly suspect that the point system is going to be simpler and easier to use. It has been the general trend from 9th to 10th. Even if it's a fair bit more simplified though, I suspect it'll still be greatly more granular than power level. Plus GW can always raise and lower them at each balance pass, which will be helpful if anything is too strong or too weak. It is kind of interesting that they confirm that Crusade mode will stay, plus power level is gone, so presumably Crusade is just switching to using points instead. Maybe it shows that there was at least some demand for that, if a fair few people were using Crusade with points already. Let me know your thoughts though. Will you be happy to see the back of power level in 40k? Or will you miss the simple army building system that it provided? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to hear more 10th edition 40k discussion, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k updates coming, with new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. and that's how I can afford to keep on making videos like this as my main thing. If you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.